29-year-old Mohamed Lukman recently made headlines for being sentenced to death. His crime? Distributing medical marijuana. In a time where marijuana has slowly been moving out of taboo and has been decriminalized or legalized in these countries, is this a fair sentence? In the 80s, Malaysia waged a war on drugs. People were caught, detained, and hung. This was echoed worldwide: the US, Portugal, Australia, and many other countries. While this war included many other drugs, we are going to talk about just marijuana. Marijuana was deemed a problem because of its psychotropic effects. Other than causing a high, it was thought to trigger psychotic episodes and harm the development of a growing brain. Since then, many of these suspicions have been proven to be right.
Certain individuals may be predisposed to certain mental health conditions, and upon this kind of release into the brain, it can trigger a previously dormant mental health disorder, and it may trigger schizophrenia, psychosis, agitation and restlessness. Common sense tells us that if it can trigger psychosis and if it acts on neurons, if it acts on pain pathways, that with long-term use, there is bound to be some sort of neurogenic changes.
And Malaysia has some of the toughest anti-drug laws. Having less than 50 grams of weed can lead you to imprisonment of up to 10 years. And more than 200 grams, you will be presumed to be a trafficker, and this will lead to a trip to the noose. However, after over 30 years, the numbers show that the war on drugs has been a failure. Ex-Home Minister Zahid Hamidi reflected how the war on drugs have failed to curb addiction rates. And this is not unique to Malaysia. Reports have made it clear that an all-out offensive against drugs just do not work. In the US, cannabis usage has increased since the 80s. And while data from Malaysia is scarce, Facebook groups in support for marijuana and investigative reports like these just go to show that it's not that out of the ordinary. Portugal, ahead of the curve, came to the realization that a war does not work. In 2001, it radically decriminalized all drugs and treated drug abuse as a health problem instead. And surprise, surprise, they've hit record low drug mortality rates, being the lowest in Western Europe. While Portugal's approach has not been without its flaws, it shed light on alternative paths to dealing with cannabis: decriminalization and legalization. But there is a clear distinction between the two.
When we talk about decriminalizing it, we're talking about removing all references to that particular drug from the list or the act. Once you decriminalize it, that means that it's no longer an offense or any offense. When you decriminalize in total and have no laws to govern it, it renders that particular type of drug subject to abuse and misuse. Right? Legalizing it would mean to the extent of allowing new legislation. So most governments would recognize also the corresponding need to regulate any potential abuse or misuse.
Decriminalizing cannabis is a good first step, but that's all it is, a first step. Our criminal justice system will be able to shift resources to tackle actual crimes, and this also prevents cannabis consumers from being labeled as criminals, which is a big change. Countless lives have been destroyed for just being in possession of marijuana. But this still leaves a vacuum for the source of cannabis. Cannabis traffickers bringing in unregulated products will still be in place. And that is problematic, which is why reports like this have shown that legalization is the way to go, stating that this gives more power to the government to control and, more importantly, regulate the flow of marijuana. It takes away the power from traffickers and ensures that users are not on the receiving end of impure goods that can and have taken lives.
Can you explain on the detail of how legalization would work?
Decriminalize cannabis as a dangerous drug under the Dangerous Drugs Act of 1952. Have in place your more effective scrutiny and training of medical practitioners and pharmacists under the Poisons Act to ensure that only they can prescribe the correct amount, dosages to people who they deem to really be in need of its medicinal benefits. If you were to do that for medicinal purposes, because the law under the Poisons Act allows for its sale and supply in retail by these people, tax revenue could be collected.
But wait, if weed is bad, why all the talk about legalization? For one, a war on drugs simply does not work. And marijuana has shown to have medical benefits.
There are two main substances that has come under scrutiny. That one is cannabinoid, which is CBD, and the other is 9-tetrahydrocannabinoid, which we'll call THC. There is good research to show that actually it has a lot of medical benefits. CBD can cause medical positive effects, whereas the THC is the one that is the culprit in creating the high that you get when you smoke pot. For some reason, you can't get pure forms of CBD. They always come in a mixture. And we find that the medical uses are positive when the CBD ratio is higher than the THC ratio. Some of the key areas in which the medical community look at cannabinoids is for treatment in neuropathic type pain. These are pain due to nerves, multiple sclerosis, where you get severe muscle spasms, and they have shown successful use in these niche areas. Also quite useful is in cancer treatment. As we know, a lot of cancer treatment is associated with nausea and vomiting, refractory nausea and vomiting, which is not amenable to the usual medications that we have. And in epilepsy, it can cause a reduction in the nerve stimulation so that it lowers the threshold for triggers of epilepsy.
And while we're at it, studies have shown that cannabis is safer than alcohol and tobacco. This study found that risks of cannabis has been overestimated while risks of alcohol underestimated. But both tobacco and alcohol are legal and regulated. Contrary to the belief that everyone's going to look like an extra in a Bob Marley music video if weed was legalized, there's a stark difference between medicinal and recreational marijuana.
In the medical community, we don't administer any medical marijuana in a smoking form. It's available as a tablet in an oil form in which people can spray it and just like a GTN spray for either improving appetite, reducing nausea, improving pain or treatment in MS. When you smoke it, for example, it is in the form of resins, and there are other chemical compounds that we inhale, and these chemical compounds can trigger different pathways, and that is one of the postulated theories of the adverse effects of smoking marijuana.
Medical marijuana can be smoked, but to minimize the effects of THC, which is what causes the high, CBD pills, oils and sprays are alternatives that could be considered. And with Malaysia being recently reported to be looking at legalizing medical marijuana, this is a conversation that we will need to have. While legalizing recreational usage of marijuana is something up for debate, that is a whole different ballgame that's a lot more contentious. It's a conversation for another time. With the current laws in place, there's no room for a person in need to acquire medical marijuana, which leads to it going underground. Case in point, Lokman. Lokman filled a gap in the market for people that needed it. And he's not the first one to do this either. There's also the case of the veteran Dr. Ganja, who was also arrested and charged for trafficking marijuana. Luckily, many, including our Prime Minister, has called for Lokman's sentence to be reviewed. That's not to say that he didn't do anything wrong. Making medicine should be left to the experts and done under strict regulations, but he definitely does not deserve to be punished like a trafficker.